those very European powers that were resisting the Nazis during the Second World War, right at the end of the war, they started oppressing people in their African colonies. And then there were these national liberation movements, and right after they achieved liberation, there were coups orchestrated by Belgium, France, and even the CIA. So if one were to give an African view of global history, it almost seems like Africans could say, we already knew that, pal, to Mr. Mark Carney, that this was already kind of, the order was already dead. What can we learn from that particular history? Because Africa always experienced that kind of, hegemonic kind of designs by Western powers, even in the middle of the 20th century with the UN and all. And we have example, whether it's apartheid, South Africa, or Congo, or other parts. And you did mention China as a kind of a slightly different actor in Africa. So if you could just shed some light on that as well.
So China really at the end of the last century, I mean, I don't go into this in the book, but just answering your question, but China began its Africa policy really at the end of the last millennium. And there's a lot of interest, of course, in China-Africa relations. And China's fine; it will, do business with you as long as you accept its policies on the 3 T's: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. Don't criticize us about our internal stuff. Don't recognize Taiwan, which most African countries don't, and don't talk about things like Tibet and so on. And then, we can do business with you. So business is business. They didn't set the conditions that the Europeans did. But I think, so broadly speaking, China-Africa trade, Africa accounts for 15% of China's trade. Africa and China's trade is 15%, but that only accounts for 5% of China's global trade. So actually you can see it's quite small. Latin America accounts for a greater proportion, because there is a lot of exaggeration, I think, in terms of China's engagement, to the detriment of, not looking at other players like Turkey and India and so on. And these are, UAE is a massive investor in Africa. And China holds about 20% of Africa's debt. We're not sure, it's difficult because you don't always get reliable figures, but that means that 80% of Africa's debt is not owed to the Chinese. And I think that, it is often because people see Chinese managers, labor, doing these massive infrastructure projects. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you'll see that actually it's a tender that may be funded by the World Bank or by the African Development Bank and so on, and the Chinese, because of their expertise in Africa, have come in with the most, efficient tender, and they'll get the job. But the Chinese don't like to disabuse people of these perceptions. They're like, oh yes, this is us building this road or doing this, that, or the other. So, but I mean, they have got many more embassies than America. They've got, that they're becoming more interested in Africa because of its minerals and its oil. It's always had, most of its trade has been with Angola and Nigeria because of oil. It takes a lot of oil from Africa. It set up its first a port abroad, a military base abroad in Djibouti in 2017. Is taking more of an interest in peacekeeping operations in Africa. So diplomatically, culturally, it sets up lots of Confucius institutes across Africa. So yes, there's real deep engagement. And of course, the Chinese story of lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty in such a short time is a very eye-catching, interesting one for the Africans. And so they often talk about the Chinese model where you put development before democracy and so on. So I think that, some of the thoughts there about China and Africa.
Thank you. I think we're going to open the floor now. We're going to take one question. And by the way, we have an excellent collection of photos that we're going to show as well whenever you feel like, from the book and generally from Africa, some amazing architecture and other things that are available in Ms. Badawi's book as well.
I wonder if I should just do that very quickly.
Okay, let's
now,
do that first, and then we open the floor.
You've talked a lot about the contemporary, and actually that's only my epilogue. Yeah. And and some of it's not in my book, but it's just, I think, as I said at the outset, that I wanted to correct this idea that there was no history in Africa before the arrival of the Europeans. So what you see behind me there are some of the pyramids in northern Sudan. So in my book, I concentrate on the 8th century BCE, before Common Era, some people say BC, and this was the period of the Kingdom of Kush. So basically northern Sudan, which we had 3 main eras of a great civilization. 2500 BCE, it was known as the Kingdom of Kerma. From 1450, it was known as the Kingdom of Napata, and then from 490, it was the Kingdom of Meroe. So this would be in the Napata period. And there are about 1,000 pyramids in Sudan, more than anywhere else in the world. There are about 100 in Egypt. I mean, these are not fantastic pictures, but these would be about the 8th century before Common Era. So you can see they're a little bit different from the Egyptian ones. After a while, the northern Sudanese, the Kushites, built tombs adjacent to the pyramids where they would bury people. But this was a great civilization. In the 8th century BCE, not only was it a great African civilization where they had, beautiful pottery and so on, the kings of Kush, and these are some of them, like King Taharqa, these are all from about the 8th, 7th century. And you can see that they look a little bit similar to what you may know from ancient Egyptian things, sculptures. These kings of Kush conquered Egypt in the 8th, 7th century and governed it for the best part of a century, and in fact built fine monuments in Egypt. And it was only later on that Egyptian pharaohs erased their names from some of these monuments. And not only did they conquer Egypt, they were actually a regional superpower. So the princes of Byblos in Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon, the princes of Tyre, King Hezekiah of Judea, appealed to these kings of Kush for protection against the Assyrians, and they encountered the Assyrians so many times. And the Assyrians, of course, Sennacherib and Assurbanipal and so on, these were really fierce, soldiers of the time. They engaged with them numerous times and defeated them, and so on and so forth. And very little is known about their history because they've been very eclipsed by, their northern neighbor. And the queens of Kush, I don't have a picture, known as Candakas, held a great deal of power as well. Women in the ancient world didn't always, but the Candakas did. They could rule as co-regents with their husbands or their sons, and in fact some of them would even lead some of their fighters into battle. So when the Romans defeated the Egyptians and Cleopatra died in 30 BC, they then turned their attention to these people further south in northern Sudan, and they fought them off. And there was Queen Amani-Renance, who was known as the one-eyed queen because she lost an eye in battle, and she forced the Romans to sign a treaty with her around 22, 23 BC. So the Romans never defeated the Kushites. So that's the kind of occluded history that I think we should know more about. And they had similar religions, similar beliefs, religious beliefs to the Egyptians. They both worshipped the god Amun-Ra. Both the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Sudanese thought that Amun-Ra resided in a mountain which is physically still in northern Sudan. And it's just interesting to note that people often say ancient Egypt isn't part of African history, but if you think of Luxor and the temple at Karnak, these are very far south. Thebes, Luxor, the ancient religious capital of Egypt, is not on the Mediterranean coast. It's much further south, close to the border with northern Sudan, and that's where they believed Amun-Ra lived. So it shows you that, ancient Egypt, ancient northern Sudan, very much part of the African story. So this is a picture of Timbuktu, and we talked earlier on about the Muslims going into, Islam going into Africa, went into West Africa from about the 8th, 9th century, from the 800s, and they, put down roots there, and they had the great Sufi traditions and so on, And they were the great kingdoms of West Africa, starting with the Empire of Ghana, which had nothing to do with modern-day Ghana, started around 600. And then you have the Kingdom of Mali, which started in 1220, and 1235, correction, 1235. And the Kingdom of Mali is when Timbuktu began to be established and so on, and it was a great centre of learning. You had the great mosque and so on, and people would come from all over Africa and even beyond to study in its great library. And they had towns and settlements, and it was a very, very rich empire. You may have heard of its most famous king, Mansa Musa I, wearing this crown here behind me. So he was born in 1280 and he died in 1332. And this is an image of him from a Spanish cartographer's map of the world. There are about 7 or 8 panels, and Mansa Musa is on one of these panels because he was seen as so significant, so he was put on it so many years after his death. And why was Mansa Musa I so significant? Well, he was reputedly the richest individual to have ever lived. He was probably worth about $435 billion in today's value, and that's in solid wealth, not just, stocks and shares. And he's most famous for carrying out a pilgrimage, because by then the kings of Mali, known as the Mansa, had become Muslims. And he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 to 25, and he went with this massive entourage, a household of about 12,000, 60,000 personal servants and, staff. He had 600 personal servants just for himself, all clad in gold and so on, with a caravan of camels, about 10 to 15 camels, 100 camels carrying about 10 to 15 tons of gold. And when he stopped off in Cairo, Ansur, the Mamluk Sultan there, he gave away so much gold and spent so much money on the journey there and back that the price of gold globally plummeted by 25% and did not recover its value for more than a decade. So this idea that Africa was on the margins of the world, that there are those who make history and those who stand on the sidelines of history, is really dispelled by the story of Mansa Musa I, because it shows how the actions of one medieval West African king really had an impact on the global economy. That's just a close-up of his picture there. But unfortunately, this image triggered so much interest in the wealth of Africa, this cartographer's map 1375, that by the early 1400s, the Portuguese thought, let's go and find out just how much gold there is in this continent. This is St. George's Church. I'm doing a quick tour here for you. We go to Ethiopia, go from west to east here. So this is Ethiopia, the modern city of Lalibela. And Lalibela takes its name after the most famous of the Zagwe kings, Lalibela, who was born in the 1100s. And he was, Lalibela means the bees must obey him, and because that's when he was born, there was a whole swarm of bees. And he's famous for having supposedly during his reign 10 of these churches hewn out of single pieces of rock. There are about 11 of them. This is the prettiest one, I think, St. George's. And they are the largest underground, rock churches to be built, hewn out of rock anywhere in the world. And these were all, built without any modern equipment or anything like that. And you can see they're absolutely stunning. So they were built around the 12th century, and they are, definitely worth a visit. Then we jump here to the south. This is Great Zimbabwe, and Great Zimbabwe is made up of the valley ruins and the hill complex and the great enclosure that you can see behind me. And this was a settlement that probably started in 600, but most of it was built in the 1100s. And you know, when European visitors went in the 19th century, they couldn't believe that Africans could have built this kind of massive enclosure and all these marvelous ruins. So again, it shows you how people can't attribute great monuments to Africans. But these were, this was, you know, it's a beautiful settlement. This photograph actually doesn't do it justice at all. And this picture here is, because I like to look at women, my book very much focuses on personalities, because I think history is best understood if it's seared into the imagination, and personalities help you do that much better. And so this is Queen Njinga, who was born in 1583 and died in 1663 at a very grand old age. And she was queen of the Ndongo kingdom, which is part of modern-day Angola. It was sort of vaguely connected to the old kingdom of Congo. And here she was sent by her brother, the king, to go and see the Portuguese governor of Luanda, because she grew up to the sound of Portuguese gunfire, because the Portuguese, by now, obviously the slave trade, really in earnest, they were taking people. And her brother, the king, sent her to go and ask the governor of Luanda to stop taking their people. When she arrived, he told her to sit on the floor, and he was sitting on his, you know, decorative chair. But she wanted to sit at eye level with him, so she got one of her attendants, picked the tallest one probably, got her to crouch for hours, poor woman, and sat on her because she didn't want to be, you know, subordinate to him. And this is the statue of Queen Njinga outside the fort in Luanda, the capital of Angola. So she's seen very much as an African heroine. And she fought the Portuguese. She eventually became queen. Her brother committed suicide, and she maneuvered her way and was a very, very powerful, very deft diplomat, very good fighter. She was good at using the fighting axe herself. And she was her father's favorite, actually. He always thought that she would be the best person to be king. So she outwitted the Portuguese, you know, every which way, and died peacefully with her crown on her head. And I think this could be the final one. Yes, so these are the examples of the Benin bronzes. And so in the 19th century, you know, Benin, which is part of southern Nigeria, it's part of Nigeria, not the Republic of Benin. The city was ransacked by the British in the 1880s, and they took away all their, you know, the marvelous treasures and so on. So I just use that as an example of restitution of artworks and so on. You know, everybody has art from countries, but Africa has 90% of Africa's art and treasures is held outside of the continent. There was a study done in France and in 2017 which concluded that. And this is an example of these bronzes. But you know, it's not just art, because a lot of these bronzes actually depict various battles and so on. So the Kingdom of Benin started in around the 1000s, 900s, 1000s, and is still around today. So you can see that there's great, you know, historic continuity. But these bronzes record various historic events. So you're not just depriving people of their artwork, you're actually depriving them of their history. So that's one thing I touch on in the book, because every chapter I try and look at a contemporary issue and then look at the history. So I start off with the restitution discussion that we're having, and then I'll go into the history of Benin. So they're just a few images just to say that, you know, my purpose in writing this was to say Africa has a history, institutions, traditions, customs, which are worthy of study, worthy of respect, and worthy of knowledge. And I think that, you know, I've learned a lot writing this, and I made the TV series. I went to 32 countries over a period of 7 years. And that's why I felt I wanted to write the book, because I hadn't really done justice to the stories and the accounts in the TV series, which is available on BBC YouTube for you to watch freely. And so that was really my main purpose, for people who are not of African descent to understand that African history is part of our global story. You should know some of it. And for people who are of African descent, I really also wanted to give a history of hope, to show that even today, you may look at, the continent and feel a bit despondent, but that long lens of history should give you some hope that it wasn't always so.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, book is full of these incredible stories. It brings a very human touch to the history of Africa. So we have a few minutes for questions. Should we take about two questions?
I think we've only got 5 minutes.
So we'll take 3 together. So we'll start with you.
I'm Ajaz, and I have this unique honor of serving in United Nations peacekeeping mission at Congo in 2014 and 15. We were based in Uvira near Lake Tanganyika, and such a great place and such a great fruits, avocados and pineapples. So my question is that United Nations was deployed to control those rebel groups there, and then it was doing fine, but lately United Nations was asked to reduce in size, and but as the size was reduced, so again law and order issues came, and then things moved from bad to worse. Recently, President Trump has conducted peace accord between Congo and Rwanda. So how long will it last, and how sustainable that peace would be?
I'll just answer that very quickly. Yeah, I mean, the M23 rebels, Rwanda and the DRC, it's a very, very messy picture, very, very messy picture. And I think almost before the ink was even dry, the agreement began to unravel, with both sides saying that they had violated it. It's a tough neighborhood in Africa, the DRC and the Rwanda story, and of course because of the genocide in Rwanda, which is still quite recent, from 1994, memories are still very strong. So, I mean, how long will it last? I don't know. I mean, Trump says he's ended 8 wars, but I don't know about that. But Pakistan, you're right, the Pakistani nation has done a great deal with peacekeeping in Africa. That's one of the strong links that you do have. I'll answer quickly, sir, because I know there's no time.
We still have 15 minutes.
Oh, I thought we had 5.
Okay, I've had the good fortune of having lived in Africa for 14 and worked in Africa for 14 years. I just had one basic question which always intrigued me, and that was that whenever I traveled from West Africa to East Africa to all these countries, there was a very heavy cover on, we were talking about religion. Culture is extremely strong in Africa, and sometimes the colonial powers also just tend to overlook it. Even the Anglican Church allows a second marriage or a third marriage in Africa. If you go to the Yoruba heartland in Nigeria and you go to a funeral or something like that, it's mainly the local culture, and Catholicism or Anglicanism is not dominant. So do you include anything about culture? Is there such thing as a South Asian culture we have? For instance, yes, in Bengal it's different, in Punjab it may be different, but there is a common thread. In Africa, is there such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, do I touch on that in the book? I think certainly certain parts of Africa, yes, you're right, that I think I said, people are just nominally, you hear stories about, people saying, oh, there's a Catholic priest there or whatever, I'm going to be dunked in water. They dunk them in water and say, right, you're Christian, that's it. They go off and they tick the box that they've become Christian, but they are still practicing their culture, particularly, as you say, in funerals and marriages and that kind of thing. And I think that's very, very strong. And what I did find is that people will do it, but they don't necessarily like to articulate it. So they'll say, yes, I'm a Christian and so on, but there's a slight feeling that perhaps it's best practiced and done, but don't overemphasize it. Certainly not in interviews that I was, conducting. So I think you're right. It's much, much stronger than people realize. It has stayed. across both Muslims and Christians. He's saying to you time's up.
It's still 5:30.
So we'll take one. We can take 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Wahadat Khan from Quetta, Balochistan. My question arises from what we have read from the political resisting movements of Africa, reading through Fanon and Ngugi. My question from you is that have you talked about the cultural colonization that Africa was put through when the colonizers came in? And because he says, Ngugi says that it's more worse than the political and economic colonization, because obviously that you can remove in a years, but cultural colonization is very difficult to remove. So how did the African nation so bravely, if they have totally removed that domination of culture that the oppressor have built in their minds, making them go their own language, their own identity, because we in Pakistan are very similarly facing all these things. So can you please elaborate
And
this?
also had a question. If we can combine that.
First of all, thank you very much for coming over to Pakistan. My question is that there are a lot of parallels you can see between countries like Pakistan and Africa. So, and the